The latest Atlantic Council Global China Hub report highlights that China is systematically shrinking Taiwan's international space through a myriad of military, diplomatic, and economic means. Taiwan's formal and informal partners, however, may be reassessing their engagement. Case in point, Honduras. Honduras severed its 82-year-long diplomatic relationship with Taiwan in 2023 and switched to recognizing instead the People's Republic of China. The decision seemed driven, at least in part, by a Chinese promise of financial incentives. However, some analysts have characterized China's pattern as one of overpromise and under-delivery. 3 years later, with Honduras, China has not quite fully fulfilled its promise. Honduras' shrimp export industry collapsed, and overall bilateral trade between Honduras and China remained sharply imbalanced. As a result, there is a degree of what seems to be buyer's remorse. Both of the top two candidates in Honduras presidential election in recent months promised to reconsider restoring diplomatic ties with Taiwan instead. One of the parties, the PN's candidate for president, Nasri Asfoura, who was successfully elected president, he said in a pre-election interview with Bloomberg that he would consider restoring diplomatic relations with Taiwan after winning office. The other party, the PL's candidate Salvador Nasrallah, who narrowly lost the race, had this to say.
I will re-establish relations with Taiwan. Taiwan is our ally. Taiwan is an ally of the US, and we depend on the US. Not only is Communist China against the US, they don't do business with us. Not only that, we've lost all our shrimp exports. Coffee exports are down half since we established relations with China and left Taiwan. That was a grave error.
So how does China use this combination of threats and inducements, or carrots and sticks, to sway Taiwan's diplomatic allies? And why does China overpromise and only to underdeliver when it woos Taiwan's partners? Lastly, how can Taiwan then break through China's blockade internationally to engage with more international community? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm your host today, Wen-Ti. To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by two very distinguished guests today. First, I have Kish Liao, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Associate Director. And I also have with us today Xie Pei-fen, who is the International Cooperation and Development Fund Deputy Secretary General. A very warm welcome to you both today, Kish and Pei-fen. Thanks for coming to the show. The Atlantic Council Global China Hub report examines 4 cases: Palau, St. Lucia, the Dominican Republic, and Honduras. It lays out Beijing's tactics. These range from economic coercion, such as banning tourism groups and illegally sending vessels into other countries' EEZ, that's exclusive economic zones. And on the other hand, there are also infrastructure promises made to these partner countries that were never fulfilled or only minimally delivered on the other hand. What this shows is a record of Beijing enticing Taiwan's diplomatic allies into switching recognition, only to under-deliver afterwards, if not entirely abandon their promises after diplomatic ties with China were established. So to discuss this question, I think I'll start with you first, Kish, on this. I understand that you are the co-authors of this report from Atlantic Council. Your report talks about how there's a few scenarios, different tactics that China employs in an attempt to lure Taiwan diplomatic allies. Can you briefly outline them?
Thank you, Wen-Ti. Yes, I think it's more appropriate to say there are 2 major groups of tactics that China usually employs. The first group is very familiar. It's carrot or sticks, right? They would induce the country with huge promises of infrastructure development, with huge loans, and also, promises to help them with free trade, with their position within the UN, with their position within certain trade organizations. As for the stick part, now, if the country is still hesitating, or shall we say not receptive to China's approaches, they would switch tactics to start basically pressuring the country by excluding them from, for example, in Palau's case, excluding them from the local tourism association meetings. They understand that tourism is a huge part of Palau's economy. The second part, of course, is peer pressure. Now, peer pressure is something that China understands, right? Like that's what China does with regional countries. This could go back to how Mao Zedong first talked about using the country to surround the cities. Now, that's exactly what they do on international stages. They would talk to countries that already have diplomatic relations with China, but located within the same region with Taiwan allies, and ask them to basically talk to these countries about how basically like they should switch recognition from Taiwan to China. For example, in regional ministerial meetings and such. I would like to also add another overlooked example of this would be to use leverage. In our previous report, we talked about Kiribati, where China, through another company located in Hong Kong, were able to control the majority share of the country's fishery company, national fishery companies, and thus almost blackmailed the country into switching recognition.
So carrots and sticks, peer pressure, social incentives or disincentives there in the equation for sure. I think I'll come to Pei Fen for my next question. We talk about what China does, what kind of tactics it tends to use. How about the impact on those diplomatic partner and potential partner countries? How are they experiencing it?
Yeah, so from this report, I guess we can see three lessons. The first is that China's promises often sound better than they turn out to be. So in several countries, in the 4 countries you mentioned, China promised big things: more trade, more tourists, huge construction projects. But after those countries switched to China, many of the promises were delayed, reduced, or never fulfilled. So at the same time, those countries lost real benefits from Taiwan, including scholarship, export markets, and technical assistance. So the lesson is that switching sides may look attractive at first, but the long-term payoff is often disappointing. And the second lesson is that relying too much on China can make a country more vulnerable. So some countries found that after turning to China, their local businesses struggled, trade deficits grew, and also governments had less control over their own development path. And the third lesson is that Taiwan's value lies in reliability rather than in scale. So Taiwan cannot offer as much money as China does, but Taiwan usually delivers what it promises. So that's very important, especially for many countries. Having a reliable partner is more useful than chasing big but uncertain deals.
Around that point about Taiwan reliability being an important factor there to consider for Taiwan's potential partners today and potentially tomorrow. I want to ask you the same question, Kish, on this as well. What's your assessment here in terms of the experience of these Taiwan diplomatic partners or ex-partners or perhaps future partners when it comes to how impact of China's tactics are being felt?
So before we proceed, I feel like it's important for us to review why diplomatic partners actually matters for Taiwan, right? I think a lot of people would question that, no doubt. They think like, why does Taiwan need all these small countries in Latin America or even in the Pacific? What does that do for Taiwan? And I would like to take this chance to tell people like, this is very important. And it's really not just about the number of diplomatic partners, excuse me. It is about deterrence for Taiwan. These countries are the only voice Taiwan has in official UN bodies and official international organizations. As Pei Fen well known when she served with one of Taiwan's allies on the United Nations. Taiwan's allies are very important. Taiwan's diplomatic allies are very important in thwarting China's attempt at this international legal warfare to basically create a precedent on official UN bodies to establish that China has every right to take Taiwan.
All right,
Now,
so that factor you mentioned there about deterrence value in maintaining Taiwan's diplomatic allies for Taiwan's international visibility and voice in general. I want to come back to you on pretty much a similar question here as well, Pei Fen. What do you think are some of the lessons learned here for Taiwan diplomatic partner countries from all this diplomatic tug of war we're seeing between China and us?
So in addition to what I just mentioned previously, I think countries should be very careful about trading a steady relationship with Taiwan for China's short-term offers, short-term benefits. What looks like a good deal at first can turn out to be something very troublesome. Economic trouble, political pressure, domestic censorship, and loss of independence. So I think that this is something that is very serious, and the countries that are considering between like recognizing Taiwan or China should take into account.
Thank you for that. On a related note, there are, of course, significant cooperation between Taiwan and other states, even when situations where formal diplomatic relations don't exactly exist. So, for example, in December, we know that U.S. State Department, they launched a Pax Silica initiative about AI supply chain security to boost U.S. cooperation with allies and trusted partners. Indeed, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, Jacob Hellberg, in a virtual press conference, he underscored how important Taiwan is in the global supply chain technology, when it comes to technology, and that Taiwan was invited to participate in the inaugural summit of the U.S.-led AI supply chain strategy initiative and actually attended several key lessons as well. So I think I'll come to Kish next for this issue here. What we're seeing here is substantive economic cooperations between U.S. and Taiwan, even in the absence of fully formal diplomatic relations. So I think it's suffice to say that important advances can happen even in lieu of formal diplomatic ties. And I'm wondering, how do you think Taiwan can replicate this model it has with U.S. when it comes to Taiwan developing relations and cooperation with other countries as well?
Thank you, Wen-Ti. That is a very important question. And obviously, U.S. is different than other countries, right? It is, if not the only one, it's the biggest security guarantor for Taiwan. Now, for Taiwan to replicate that relationship, especially with countries without diplomatic relations, it is important, and this point is well taken by a lot of people within the process of EP750 already, that when Taiwan was pushing for its own semiconductor diplomatic policies, one of the hurdles encountered was that it's hard to basically have a concrete part of your supply chain to basically be segregated into another country. But for something concrete to happen, Taiwan needs to be able to come up with that, right? And I believe Taiwan can, in cooperation with US, establish a sort of a supply chain, both in semiconductor, both in AI, that involves countries that's important for Taiwan. We can start with diplomatic allies, such as what we're doing right now with Guatemala, right? Taiwan is doing with Guatemala. But you can also expand this to other countries of importance, such as other parts of Latin America, to quote, like basically, the U.S. New National Security Strategy's focus on the Western Hemisphere.
That's definitely an important point to note here, and I want to turn to Pei-Fen for my next question. What we have been seeing, of course, is China's continued full court press diplomatically to shrink Taiwan's international space, and that's kind of a given by this point. So given this reality of constant Chinese pressure, how do you think Taiwan should go about enhancing its international presence and visibility? And specifically, do you see some maybe priority areas cooperation Taiwan should be investing its energy on?
Indeed, given that China is pushing very hard on Taiwan, we should definitely strengthen our international presence. That's very important, not only for us, but also for our like-minded countries, partners as well. So the key, I believe, is not trying to be everywhere, but focusing on areas where Taiwan's involvement brings a more strategic value for the least political cost. So I think there are a few areas, as mentioned previously. Technology and supply chain security is very important. So that's Taiwan's strongest card. Semiconductor, AI hardware, advanced manufacturing, just to name a few. And also disaster relief, public health, that's also very Taiwan's advantage. And also, I think there's one area that is often overlooked, is cybersecurity cooperation, because that's something Taiwan has experienced so many cyber attacks from certain countries. And also that's something we have a lot of experiences, and that's something we can contribute a lot. And also China cannot participate in this discussion. And there's no one China, I believe there's no one China policy in cybersecurity area. So I think that's also something we can work on with other countries as well. And also, I think there's another advantage of Taiwan, which is our soft power, our capacity building programs. For example, the organization I'm working with, the Taiwan ICDF, we offer a lot of scholarships and capacity buildings in agriculture, in public health, in disaster relief, in different areas for our partner countries, especially for the Pacific Islands and Caribbean population. I believe some of the areas can be very, very important for them.
That's great points. So don't try to be everything to everyone everywhere. You'll stretch yourself too thin in that sense. Instead, try to prioritize. And ICTF, you sort of mentioned that example. These are like society to society level exchanges, things that build up goodwill over time, isn't it? And Kish, I see that you had your hands up.
I would just like to add a few points from the report at the risk of tooting our own horn, right? One of the major recommendations, especially for all the good work that ICDF is doing, is to basically make that ask to Taiwan's partner countries explicit, right? The reason Taiwan is doing all of this, and for any country for that matter, diplomacy has two goals. You either want security or you either want economic prosperity. Now for Taiwan, obviously the value of security, of deterrence against China is an outsized one because that's what Taiwan needs. But yet, one of the things is Taiwan often neglect to actually mention that part to their good economic partners. And I do believe Taiwan can do better on that, right? Link your programs, link your aid directly with the ask to support Taiwan's fight against Chinese coercion. Because for sure, China is doing that, even if you don't.
Moving on December 29th, China suddenly announced a large-scale military exercise encircling Taiwan. 2 days later, China's President Xi Jinping, he used his New Year's address to speak at length about peace and reunification. Let's watch him.
中国始终站在历史正确一边，愿同各国携手促进世界和平发展，推动构建人类命运共同体，两岸同胞血浓于水，祖国统一的历史大势不可阻挡。
Meanwhile, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te emphasized strengthening national defense and the resilience of the society. He also had this to say.
国际对台湾的支持从未间断，不止美国、日本、英国、欧盟等多国都纷纷展现对台湾以及台海和平稳定的支持。近期，美国宣布史上最大的对台军售案，和美国国家战略报告所提到的台湾的重要性，都再告诉我们，台湾已不只是不可或缺，更是国际社会中值得信赖、负责任的良善力量。
Pei-Fen, I want to come to you. How do you assess these New Year messages from President Lai Ching-te and from Xi Jinping when it comes to the messages here on international support for Taiwan as well as China's current policy thinking on Taiwan?
There's a very sharp difference between the two speeches. So Xi Jinping talks a lot about reunification and use words like bond of blood and kinship to make it sound like Taiwan naturally belong to China. So even when he mentioned peace and working with other countries, he ties back to China's view that it's on the right side of the history. And on the other hand, Lai Ching-te's speech focused on protecting Taiwan and getting ready for possible threats. So he pointed out that Taiwan has strong support from countries like the US, Japan, the UK, and the EU. So he also stressed that Taiwan is trustworthy and responsible, showing that Taiwan is not just resisting China, but is also trying to be a positive player in the world. So comparing the two, Xi's speech is mostly about China's claim and trying to convince the world that Taiwan belongs to China, while Lai Ching-te's speech shows Taiwan's strategy, being resilient, being strong, building alliances, and showing that Taiwan can be a responsible country that other countries can trust on.
Kitch, I'll let you play tea leaf reader here for a second here. So there seems to be, some people would say there seems to be some level of contradiction here on how China goes about messaging to Taiwan. On the one hand, of course, there are these nice olive branch, peace and unification, let's get along, that kind of rhetoric. And on the other hand, you do have this military drill that's happening within about 24 to 48 hours around those nice words as well. So what do you think this juxtaposition, let's say, tells you about China's mentality?
So first thing, it's very important, let's correct the vernacular here, right? China always uses reunification. But Taiwan was never part of the People's Republic of China. And that's part of it. All of China's vernaculars, all of China's historical mentions, they are rewriting history of World War II as we speak. They repainted planes in Beijing's Aviation Museum because they were holding celebrations with Russia on Second World War, and it would be uncouth to have representation of Taiwan Republic China Forces logo on one of the airplanes, right? And that's the thing. Whenever China shows supposedly an olive branch, it was never really about compromises. It was basically to allow people a venue to surrender. They don't talk about peace in the sense of, well, we'll compromise. They talk about peace in the sense that, well, if you give up what you do and accede to all my demands, then we'll have peace. That's not peace, that's called surrender. To contrast this with the drill that's going on, it is very obvious that drill is a prop, and the important thing is information and psychological manipulation that CCP is doing right now, both against the Taiwan public and against the international audience.
All right, I think I'll be remiss if I let you go without asking you about this one thing that's been the talk of town recently, and that is what happened in Venezuela. We know that Trump administration launched a decapitation strike against Venezuela, President Maduro over there. And one thing that we keep hearing people asking about lately is, what does the example of decapitation strike against Venezuela mean to China-Taiwan relations? And maybe I'll ask you about this, Pei-Fen, this question. Do you think this episode affect China's strategy towards Taiwan at all, or is it just mainly useful for rhetorical talking points here?
Yeah, well, this is a very tough question. I think this Venezuela case is geographically and politically very different from the situation we were talking about. So I think China still views Taiwan as part of it, and is still trying to use force to force unification with China. So I believe the Beijing's condemnation of what the U.S. did in Venezuela is more for discourse, more for presenting itself as a defender of international rules and orders. But while China is disturbing the international rule and order in the Taiwan Strait and also in South China Sea. So I think Beijing's action is more for its own discourse rather than change of behavior.
Kish, any final words you want to say on this?
Yeah, of course. Two things, right? Looking at Venezuela, it is quite hypocritical for China to accuse the U.S. of eyeing Venezuela's oil interest, while on its own it sank about $100 billion into Venezuela's oil industry in the hope of reaping the benefits from that. And in the past few days, we can also see they didn't actually expend any real political capital to basically accuse U.S. of any wrongdoing. It's the typical rhetoric. As for Taiwan's decapitation case, That has always been part of China's plan, right? And Taiwan has a counter to that. It's called 万军车队, right? They have annual exercises to validate whether that works or not, how to protect the president, and all that. Well, the good news is, for China to conduct a decapitation strike against Taiwan would not be the end of the war. It might actually turn the opinion against them. So they need to follow that up with everything else we're talking about, which means like they would not just launch the operation like that, on top of everything we think about. For example, the PLA's inability to conduct a smooth joint operation, even though that's been their focus for the last 20 years.
On that note, I think that's all the time we have today. So I'd like to thank my two very distinguished guests today, Pei-Fen and Kish, for so generously sharing your time and your expertise with us today. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.